Book the 10th, Chapter 4 of Charlotte's Inheritance. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Celine Major. Charlotte's Inheritance by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. Chapter 4. Only a Dream. "I say, Lenoble," Captain Paget began abruptly one afternoon when his daughter and his future son-in-law were in attendance upon his sofa, "when are you and Diana to be married? There is nothing to hinder your marriage now, you know." Diana looked at the speaker with a grave countenance. "Dear papa, there can be no marriage while you are so ill," she said gently. "And afterwards, when I'm gone, you won't like to marry within 6 months of your father's funeral, and you will be left alone in the world. You can't hang on to Hawkehurst and his wife. The best thing you can do, Lenoble, is to marry her out of hand, and let me see her by my bedside as Madame Lenoble of Côtenoir. It will be some consolation for me to see that day. I thought to have shared your home, with a run to Paris occasionally, just to freshen myself up a little, but that's all over now. It does seem rather hard to me sometimes. And I think of Moses, and his 40 years in the desert with those ill-conditioned Israelites, who were always getting into some scrape or other, setting up golden calves and that kind of thing, if he turned his back on them for 24 hours. A pack of ungrateful beggars, too, always ready for mutiny. Regular radicals, begad! And he went through it all, the sand, the toujours quails, and the ingratitude. And after 40 years of it, when he saw the promised land stretched before him green and fertile on the other side of the river, he died. I've been through my desert, the dreary wanderings over the barren sand, and the ingratitude of men I've served. Yes, gone through it all. And just as I catch a glimpse of Canaan, the curtain drops." On this they comforted him, and sustained him with the promise of a brighter Canaan than Côtenoir. "Yes," he said in a dreamy voice, "I read about it very often. A city with foundations of jasper and chalcedony, emerald and sardonyx, gates of pearl, pavements of gold. That's what St. John the Evangelist saw in his vision, and we've only his word for it. But there's something that I can believe and can understand. In my Father's house there are many mansions. There's more hope for a sinful man of the world in that promise than in all St. John's dreams about gates of pearl and foundations of emerald." The captain was failing fast. He had exchanged his easy-chair for a sofa now, and the time seemed near at hand when he must exchange the sofa for his bed. After that there would remain but one last change, to the contemplation whereof the sick man was becoming daily more reconciled. He had read his Gospel more diligently of late, and had taken comfort from those sublime pages. Do they not contain consolation, hope, promise for all, for the weary man of the world, as well as for the saint? There is to be found the only creed that can adapt itself to every condition of life, and has a margin wide enough for every weakness of erring humanity. Buddhism may contain a scheme of morality almost as perfect. Mahomet may have expounded hopes that seem well nigh as divine. But in the Gospel is the only system that will adapt itself at once to the culture of the spiritual man, and the active life of the practical worker in this lower world. Gustave Lenoble was only too glad to claim his promised wife a little sooner than he had hoped to claim her. "Thou hast put me off long enough, cruel," he said, "and now it is thy father's wish that our marriage should be soon. It shall be this week. I will take no longer thine excuses. We shall be the sooner ready to receive thy friends, thy Charlotte, and her Hawkehurst." Diana smiled. "Dear Gustave, you are always kind." It was very sweet to her to think that her new home would afford a pleasant haven for that dear friend who had sheltered her. And with Charlotte, the dear adopted sister, would come the man she had once loved, to share whose cares had once been the brightest dream. She wondered at her own inconsistency on perceiving how completely the dream had flown. Before the stern realities of life, before sickness and sorrow, and the dread shadow of death, that schoolgirl's vision had utterly melted away. It is just possible that Gustave's manly outspoken love may have helped to blot from the tablet of her mind the fantastic picture of the life that might have been. She scarcely knew whether this was so, but she did know that a new and happier existence began for her from the hour in which she gave her heart in all truth and loyalty to Gustave Lenoble. The wedding was arranged to take place within a week of Captain Paget's expressly declared wish. It was to be solemnized at a church near Knightsbridge, and again at a Catholic chapel in the neighbourhood of Sloane Street, by which double ceremonial a knot would be tied that no legal quibble could hereafter loosen. Charlotte was just sufficiently recovered to obtain permission to be present at the ceremonial, after some little exercise of her persuasive powers with the medical practitioner to whose care Dr. Jedd had committed her when all danger was past. The Captain protested, with an eager insistence, that the wedding breakfast should be eaten at his domicile. "And Val," he said, "be sure Val is with you. I have a secret to tell him, a kind of atonement to make. Some news to give him that he won't quite relish, perhaps, but that's no fault of mine." "No bad news, I hope, papa, for Charlotte's sake as well as for Valentine's." "That depends upon how they both take it. Your friend Charlotte is not particularly fond of money, is she?" "Fond of money, papa? A baby knows as much of the value of money as Lotta. Except to give to beggars in the streets, or to buy pretty, frivolous presents for her friends, she has neither use nor desire for money. She is the most generous, most disinterested of created beings." "I'm very glad to hear it," said the Captain dryly. "And how about Hawkehurst, now? Do you think it was a real love match, his marriage with Miss Halliday? No arrière-pensée? No looking out for the main chance at the bottom of his romantic attachment, Di?" "No, papa. I am sure there was never truer love than his. I saw him under most trying circumstances, and I can pledge myself for the truth of his devotion." "I am very glad to hear it. Be sure you bring Hawkehurst and his wife to my little breakfast. A chicken, a pine, a bottle of sparkling hock, and a fond father's blessing are all I shall give you, but the chicken and the hock will be from Gunter, and the blessing from the bottom of a paternal heart." Bright shone the day that gave Diana to her husband, and very beautiful looked the bride in her simple dress. Gustave Lenoble's marriage was no less quietly performed than that union which had secured the safety of Charlotte Halliday and the happiness of Valentine Hawkehurst. The shadow of death hovered very near bride and bridegroom, for they knew full well that he who was to preside that day at their simple marriage feast would soon have tasted that last sacred cup which has no after flavour of bitterness. The breakfast promised by the Captain was arranged with much elegance: hothouse flowers and fruits, wines with the ice-dew sparkling on the dark glass, chickens and tongue, idolized by the confectioner's art, and scarcely recognizable beneath rich glazings and embellishments of jellies and forcemeats, the airiest and least earthly of lobster salads, and a pyramid of coffee ice testified to the glory of the Belgravian purveyor. It had been pleasant to Captain Paget to send his orders to Gunter, certain of funds to meet the bill. It was almost a glimpse of that land of milk and honey, that Canaan in Normandy, which he was never to inhabit. He was very weak, very ill, but the excitement of the occasion in some measure sustained and revivified him. The man who had been engaged to nurse and wait upon him had attired him with much care in a dressing gown as elegant as the robe in which he had disported himself, a penniless young cornet, in his luxurious garrison quarters, some 50 years before. His loose white locks were crowned with an embroidered smoking cap, his patrician instep was set off by a dainty scarlet slipper. He had put away the gospel, and all thoughts of that dread reckoning which he had really some shadowy desire and hope to settle satisfactorily, by some poor dividend which might discharge his obligations to that merciful creditor who forgives so many just debts. To-day he was of the world, worldly. He was a kind of ante-mortem lying in state, his last levee, and he was equal to the occasion. The prettily adorned table was drawn near the sofa where the invalid host reclined, supported by numerous pillows. His daughter and her husband, Valentine, Charlotte, and Georgie, made a little circle about him. His own man and a clerical-looking person from Gunter's assisted at the airy banquet. Very little was eaten by any of the guests, and it was a relief to everyone when the clerical personage and Captain Paget's factotum retired, after serving tea and coffee with funereal solemnity. Valentine Hawkehurst was all gentleness and cordiality towards his old taskmaster. The wrong must indeed be dire which is considered in such an hour as this. Valentine remembered only that with this old man he had seen many troubled days, and that for him the end of all earthly wanderings was very near. The little banquet was not served in Captain Paget's ordinary sitting-room. For this distinguished occasion the landlady had lent a dining-room and drawing-room on the ground floor, just deserted by a fashionable bachelor lodger who had left town at the close of the season. This drawing-room on the ground floor, like the room above, overlooked the park, and to this apartment the captain requested his guests to adjourn, with the exception of Mr. Hawkehurst, some little time after the departure of the servants. "I want to have a few words with Val in private," he said. "I have a secret to communicate. Diana, show Mrs. Hawkehurst the drive. You can see the Bow from my room, but not from these lower windows. There are a good many carriages still, but it is too late for the crème de la crème. I remember when the West End was a desert at this time of year. But I have lived to see the levelling of all distinctions, those of time as well as of class." Charlotte and Diana retired to the adjoining room with Mrs. Sheldon and M. Lenoble. Valentine was at a loss to imagine what manner of confidential communication his late patron and employer could desire to impart to him. The cautious Horatio waited until the rest of the party were quite out of hearing, talking gaily by the open window, beyond which appeared all the fluttering life and motion of summer leaves, all the brightness of summer green below, and deep blue sky above. When they seemed to him to be quite engaged with their own conversation, Captain Paget turned to his old companion. "Val," he said, "we have seen hard times together. We've roughed it among strange places and strange people, you know, and so on. And I think there is a friendly kind of feeling between us." He held out his poor wasted hand, and Valentine grasped it firmly in his own with prompt cordiality. "My dear governor, I have no feeling in my heart that is not friendly to you." This was perfectly true. "And even if I had been inclined to bear any grudge against you on account of the old days, when, you know, you were a little apt to be indifferent as to what scrape you left me in, provided you got off scot-free yourself, if I had been inclined to remember that kind of thing, which on my honour I am not, your daughter's noble courage and devotion in the time of my dear wife's peril should have stood against that old wrong. I cannot tell you how deeply I feel her goodness in that bitter time." "She is a Paget," murmured the captain complacently. "Noblesse oblige." Valentine could scarcely refrain from a smile, as he remembered the many occasions upon which the obligations of a noble lineage had weighed very lightly on his aristocratic patron. "Yes, Val," the captain resumed in a dreamy tone, "we have seen many strange things together. When I began my travels through this world, in the palmy days of the Regency, I little thought what a weary journey it was to be, and what queer people I was to encounter among my fellow passengers. However, I've come to the last stage of the long journey now, and I thank Providence that it ends so comfortably." To this Valentine assented kindly, but he was at a loss to understand why Captain Paget should have required the adjournment of the rest of the party before giving utterance to these mild commonplaces. For some moments the invalid relapsed into thoughtful silence. Then, rousing himself as if with an effort, he took a few sips of a cooling drink that stood by his side, and began with a startling abruptness. "You remember your journey to Dorking, Val, last October, when you went to see that mysterious old aunt of yours, eh?" Valentine blushed as the captain recalled this cunningly devised fable. "Yes," he said gravely, "I remember telling you that I was going to see an aunt at Dorking." "An aunt who had a little bit of money, eh, Val?" asked the captain with a grin. "Yes, I may have gone so far as to speak of a little bit of money." "And neither the aunt nor the bit of money ever existed, eh, Val?" "They were mere figments of the brain. And instead of going to Dorking you went to Ullerton, eh, Val? You stole a march upon me there. You wanted to throw your old chum off the scent, eh? You thought you had got hold of a good thing, and you were afraid your friend and companion might get a share of it." "Well, you see, my friend and companion had a knack of getting the lion's share. Besides, this good thing was not my own affair. I had to protect the interest of another person, my employer, in point of fact, and it was by his suggestion, and in compliance with his request, that I invented that harmless fiction about Dorking. I don't think there was any dishonourable dealing in the matter. We were soldiers of fortune, both, and the stratagem with which I protected myself against you was a very innocent one. You would have employed any stratagem or invented any fiction under the same circumstances. It was a case of diamond cut diamond." "Precisely. And if the older soldier, if the free lance of many a campaign, got the best of it in the long run, the younger freebooter could hardly think himself ill-used, could he now, Val?" "Well, no, I suppose not," replied Valentine, puzzled by the significance in the face of his old companion. That sly twinkle in the captain's eyes, that triumphant smile wreathing the captain's lips, must surely mean mischief. Valentine Hawkehurst remembered the vague suspicion that had flashed into his mind on that Christmas Eve, when Captain Paget and he had dined together at the West End restaurant, and the captain had toasted Charlotte Halliday with a smile of sinister meaning. He began to anticipate some startling and unpleasant revelation. He began to understand that in some manner this inscrutable schemer had contrived to overreach him. "What are you going to tell me?" he asked. "I see there is some lurking mischief in your mind. How was it you were at Ullerton when I was there? I met you on the platform of the station, and I had a vague half-suspicion that you followed me up on more than one occasion. I saw a glove in a man's parlour, a glove which I could have sworn to as yours. But when I came back, you were so plausible with your talk of promoting business and so on, that I was fool enough to believe you. And I suppose you cheated and tricked me after all?" "Cheated and tricked are hard words, my dear Val," said the captain with delightful blandness. "I had as much right to transact imaginary business in the promoting line at Ullerton as you had to visit a fictitious aunt at Dorking. Self-interest was the governing principle in both cases." "I do not think you can have any right to consider yourself injured by me, if I did steal a march upon you, and follow close upon your heels throughout that Ullerton business. I do not think that you can have, on moral grounds, any justification for making a complaint against your old ally." "Well, I suppose you are right enough in that," said Valentine. "Shake hands upon it, then. I have not very long to live, and I want to feel myself at peace with mankind. You see, if you had come to me in the first place in a frank and generous spirit and had said, 'My dear friend, here is a good thing, let us go into it together, and see what there is to be made out of it,' you would have placed the matter on such a footing that, as a man of honour, I should have been bound to regard your interests as my own. But when you set up a separate interest, when you try to throw dust in my eyes, to hoodwink me, Horatio Paget, a man of the world, possessed of some little genius for social diplomacy, you attempt to do that which no man ever yet succeeded in doing, and you immediately release me from those obligations which an honourable man holds sacred. It was my glove which you saw in Mr. Goodge's parlour. I had a very satisfactory interview with that reverend person while you were absent from Ullerton on some short excursion, as to the purpose of which I am still in the dark. On certain terms, Mr. Goodge agreed to give me the privilege of selecting a stated number from the letters of Mrs. Rebecca Haygarth. I have reason to believe that I made a judicious choice, for the information thus obtained placed me at once upon a track which I followed industriously until it led me to a triumphant result." "I do not understand," began Valentine, but the captain did not allow him to say more. "You do not understand that there could be any other genealogical line than that which you and George Sheldon fitted together so neatly. You have neither of you the experience of life which alone gives wideness of vision. You discovered the connections of the Haygarth and the Meynell families in the past. That was a step in the right direction. The discovery, so far as it went, was a triumph. You allowed the sense of that triumph to intoxicate you, In a business which, of all businesses within the range of man's intellect, most requires deliberation and sobriety, you went to work in a fever of haste and excitement. Instead of searching out all the descendants of Christian Meynell, you pounce upon the first descendant who comes to hand, and elect her, at your own pleasure, sole heiress to the estate of the deceased John Haygarth. You forget that there may be other descendants of the said Christian Meynell, descendants standing prior to your wife Charlotte in the line of succession." "I can imagine no such descendants existing," said Valentine, with a puzzled manner. "You seem to have made yourself master of our business, but there is one point upon which you are mistaken. George Sheldon and I did not go to work in a fever of haste. We did fully and thoroughly examine the pedigree of that person whom we, and legal advisers of considerable standing, believed to be the sole heir at law to the Haygarth estate, and we took good care to convince ourselves that there was no other claimant in existence." "What do you call convincing yourselves?" "Christian Meynell had only 3 children, Samuel, Susan, and Charlotte. The last, Charlotte, married James Halliday, of Newhall and Highley Farms. The other 2 died unmarried." "How do you know that?" "How do you propose to demonstrate that Samuel and Susan Meynell died unmarried?" "Susan was buried in her maiden name. Mrs. Halliday, her sister, was with her when she died. There was no question of marriage, nor is there the record of any marriage contracted by Samuel." "All that is no proof." "Indeed. I should have thought the evidence sufficient. But in any case, the onus probandi is not upon us. Can you prove the marriage of the Samuel Meynell who died at Calais, or of the Susan Meynell who died in London?" "I can. Susan Meynell's legitimate son is in the next room. It's an unpleasant kind of revelation to make, Val, as he, the son of one sister, stands prior to your wife, the granddaughter of the other sister, in the order of succession. And he takes all." "He takes all?" repeated Valentine, bewildered. "He? Susan Meynell's son? In the next room? What does all this mean?" "It means that when Susan was deserted by the scoundrel who took her away from her home, she found an honest fellow to marry her. The name of her husband was Lenoble. Gustave Lenoble yonder, my daughter's husband, is her only child by that marriage. A perfectly legal marriage, my dear Val. Everything en règle, I assure you. The business is in the hands of Messrs. Dashwood and Vernon of Whitehall, a first-class firm. Counsel's opinion most decided as to Lenoble's position. They have been rather slow about the preliminary steps, and, entre nous, I have not cared to hurry them, for I wanted to get my daughter's marriage over quietly before we began our proceedings in Chancery. It comes rather hard upon you, Val, I allow. But you see, if you had acted generously, not to say honourably, towards me in the first instance, you'd have had the advantage of my experience. As it is, you have been working in the dark. However, things are not so bad as they might be. You might have married some ugly old harridan for the sake of this Haygarth estate. You have secured a pretty and amiable wife, and you mustn't be downhearted if you find yourself, from a financial point of view, most outrageously sold." The Captain could not refrain from a laugh as he contemplated his young friend's surprise. The laugh degenerated into a fit of coughing, and it was some little time before the enfeebled Horatio was ready to resume the interrupted conversation. In this pause Valentine had leisure to face this new position. There was for the moment a sharp sense of disappointment. It is not possible for humanity to be quite indifferent to £100,000. So much of the light and sweetness of life is attainable for that sum. Such pleasures, of the purest and noblest, are in the power of the possessor. But in this moment Valentine fully realized the fact that he had never taken the idea of this fortune into his mind, never made it part and parcel of himself, to be plucked out of his heart with anguish, and to leave a bleeding wound in the place where it had grown. It seemed to him as if he had been wakened abruptly from some bright, bewildering dream. But the sharp pang of mercenary desires disappointed, of sordid hopes suddenly reft, was not for him. Beyond this sense of uncertainty, which had made the Haygarthian fortune seem at best such stuff as dreams are made of, there had been ever present in his mind of late the dismal association connected with this money. For this, and to get power over this through the rights of his weak wife, had Philip Sheldon plotted against the life of that sweet girl who was but newly rescued from the jaws of the grave. The bitter memory of those days and nights of suspense could never have been quite dissociated from the money that had been the primary cause of all this slow torture. "Do you think I shall love my wife any less because she has no claim to the Haygarth estate?" he exclaimed presently, looking with half contemptuous indignation upon the broken-down Bohemer. "I loved her long before I knew the name Haygarth. I should have loved her if I had found her a beggar in the London streets, a peasant girl weeding for 6 pence a day in some dismal swamp of agricultural poverty and ignorance. I am not going to say that this money would not have brought us pleasure, pictures and gardens, and bright rooms, and books without number, and intercourse with congenial acquaintance and delightful journeyings to all the fairest places upon the earth, and the power to do some good in our generation, and a sense of security for our future, and by, perhaps, for the future of dear children, for whose prosperity we should be more anxious than for our own. Pleasure the money would most probably have brought for us in abundance, but I doubt if it could buy us more perfect happiness than we may know in the simplest home that my toil can support. Ah, Captain, I question if you ever knew the sweetest sensation life can give, the delight of working for those we love." Captain Paget stared at his sometime protégé in a kind of rapture of wonder, not entirely unmingled with admiration. "Egad!" he exclaimed, "I have read of this kind of thing in novels, but in the whole course of my experience I never met with anything equal to it. My son-in-law, Lenoble yonder, is a generous fellow enough; but then, since infancy, he has never known the want of money. And generosity from that kind of man is no more of a virtue than the foolhardiness of a child who pokes his finger into the candle, not knowing the properties of the thing he has to deal with. But anything like generosity from you, from a man reared as you were reared, is, I freely confess, a little beyond my comprehension." "Yes, it is a transformation, is it not? But I don't think I was ever inordinately fond of money. Your genuine Bohemian rarely is. He is too well schooled in the art of living without cash, and he asks so little here below. His pipe, his friend, his dog, his books, his garret, his billiards, his beer. It is all a question of a few pounds a week. And if, some day, the divine enchanter Love takes the poor fellow under his guidance, and teaches him to do without billiards and beer, your Bohemian settles down into the purest and best of men. Think what gold he might have been if some good woman had taken compassion upon him and married him, and henpecked him ever afterwards. He might have written as many novels as Sir Walter Scott, and died master of some Hibernian Abbotsford, some fair domain among the bright green hills that look down upon broad Shannon's silvery falls. No, Captain, your intelligence has not annihilated me. I can face the future boldly with my dear young wife upon my arm." "Upon my soul, Val, you're a very noble fellow," exclaimed Horatio Paget, with real enthusiasm, "and I am sorry I have kept you in the dark so long." "You have kept me in the dark? Yes, to be sure. How long have you known this about Susan Meynell?" "Well, my dear boy, not very long." "But how long? A month? 2 months?" "Yes. You have known Lenoble's position ever since you knew him. And Charlotte told me 3 months ago of Diana's engagement to Lenoble. Do you know that if Sheldon had succeeded, Charlotte's blood would have been upon your head? If you had not concealed the truth, his villainy would never have been attempted." "But, my dear Val," exclaimed the Captain piteously, "I was not to know." "No, you were not to know that there could be such a wretch as Philip Sheldon upon this earth. We will say no more of that. I kept my secret, you kept yours. Mischief unspeakable well nigh came of all this underhand work. But Heaven has been merciful to us. We have passed through the valley of the shadow of death. And if anything could make my wife dearer to me than she was when first I won her promise to be mine, it would be the sorrow of the last few months. And now I will go and shake hands with Lenoble, my wife's kinsman. He is a fine fellow, and well deserves his good fortune. Stay, one word. Did Diana know this? Did she know that her lover is heir to the Haygarth estate? She does not know it now. She has never heard the name of Haygarth. And between you and me, Val, it cost me a world of trouble to persuade her to say yes to Lenoble's offer, though he is a very decent match for her, even without reference to the Haygarth estate. I am glad she knew nothing of this, said Valentine. I am very glad. After this, he again shook hands with Captain Paget, at that gentleman's request, and the captain expressed himself much relieved by the conversation, and by his late protégée's very generous behaviour. He called to his daughter and the rest presently, and they came at his summons. "Is your long talk finished, papa?" asked Diana. "And is the secret told?" demanded Charlotte of her obedient husband and slave. "Yes, dear, it is told," he answered gravely. "I hope it is a pleasant secret." "I do not think the knowledge of it will give you much pain, dearest. You have learnt to think yourself a kind of an heiress of late, have you not?" "Papa, Mr. Sheldon, told me that I had a claim to some money, but I have not thought much about it, except that I should give you groat and Macaulay in dark brown calf, with bevelled boards and red edges, like that edition you saw at the auctioneer's in Bond Street, and have talked about ever since, and a horse perhaps, and a glass porch to our cottage." "Well, darling, the books in dark brown calf, and the horse, and the glass porch may all be ours in the future, but the money was only a dream. It has melted away, dear." "Is that all?" asked Charlotte. "Why, I dare say the day will come when you will be as rich as Sir Walter Scott." "In the meantime I have something to give you instead of the money." "Indeed?" "Yes, a cousin. Will that do as well, my love?" "A cousin? I shall like her very much if she is nice." "The cousin I mean is a gentleman." "But where is he to come from?" cried Charlotte, laughing. "Has he dropped from the moon? The only relations I have the world are Uncle and Aunt Mercer. How can you pretend to find me a cousin?" "Do you remember telling me of your grandmother's only sister, Susan Meynell?" "Yes," said Charlotte with a sudden blush. "I remember." "That Miss Meynell married a gentleman of Normandy, and left one only child, a son. His name is Gustave Lenoble, and he is standing by your side. He is heir at law to a very large fortune, which it was once supposed you could claim. Are you sorry, Lotta, to find a kinsman and lose a fortune? And are you contented to begin the world with no hope except in your husband's patience and courage?" "And genius!" cried Charlotte with enthusiasm. The sweet, blinding glamour of love shone upon this young scribbler, and she believed that he was indeed worthy to take rank among the greatest of that grand brotherhood of which he was so humble a member. She looked up at him with the prettiest confidence. Her clinging hand clasped his with love and trust immeasurable. He felt and knew that love like this was a treasure beside which the Reverend John Haygarth's hoarded thousands must needs seem but sorry dross. After this there was much explanation and congratulation. Gustave Lenoble was delighted to claim so fair a kinswoman. "Thou art like my eldest, my cousin," he said. "Diana saw the likeness at the Sacré-Cœur when she beheld my daughter. And I too saw my eldest's look in thine eyes when I first met thee. Remember, it was convened between us that Côtenoir should be a home for thee and for Hawkehurst, before I knew what link bound thee to the house of Lenoble. Now thou and thy husband will be of our family." Diana was bewildered, grieved, indignant with the father who had deceived her by his studious suppression of the truth. She found herself placed in the position of rival to Charlotte, and the whole proceeding seemed to her mean and treacherous. But it was no time for remonstrance or open expression of indignant feeling. Her father's days were numbered. She knew this, and she held her peace. Nor did Mrs. Sheldon utter any word of complaint, though the disappointment she experienced upon hearing this revelation was very keen. The idea of the £4,000 or £5,000 which were to come to Charlotte had been a consolation to her in the midst of that confusion and desolation which had newly come upon her life. She left Knightsbridge that evening somewhat depressed in spirits, and half inclined to be angry with Charlotte and her husband for their gaiety of manner, and evident happiness in each other's society. "It seems hard to have to begin the world at my age," she murmured hopelessly, "after being accustomed to have everything nice about me, as I had at the Lawn, though I own that the trouble and care of the servants was wearing me to the grave." "Dear mamma," exclaimed Charlotte tenderly, "there is no fear of trouble or poverty for you or for us. Valentine has plenty of money, and is on the high road to securing a comfortable income. Authors do not starve in garrets now, you know, as they used to do, poor things, when Dr. Johnson ate his dinner in a cave, or something dreadful of that kind. And when Sir Richard Steele thought it quite a wonderful thing to get a pound of tea for his wife. And Valentine's heart is in his profession, and he will work for us." "As long as I have a hand that can write and a brain that can guide my pen," interposed Mr. Hawkehurst gaily, "I have given hostages to fortune. I can face the hazard boldly. I feel as confident and as happy as if we lived in the golden age, when there was neither care nor toil for innocent mankind, and all the brightest things of earth were the spontaneous gift of the gods." End of Chapter 4. Read by Celine Major. Book the 10th, Chapter 5 of Charlotte's Inheritance. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Celine Major. Charlotte's Inheritance by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. Chapter 5. Bohemian Independence. Monsieur and Madame Lenoble went to Brighton for their honeymoon. A letter or a telegraphic message would bring them thence swiftly to the bedside of the dying captain, should the last fatal change set in suddenly. Diana had wished to stay with her father, but Horatio insisted upon the honeymoon trip, and that everything should be done in a correct and gentlemanly manner. "You can engage rooms at the Albion," Captain Paget had said to his son-in-law a few days before the quiet wedding. "The house is extremely comfortable, and you will be received by a compatriot. The proprietor is a Frenchman, a very gentlemanly person, I assure you. The cuisine irreproachable. I remember the old Stein when Mrs. Fitzherbert lived close by, and received all the best people, in the days when the Cockney had not yet taken possession of Brighthelmstone, and the Chinese dragons and pagodas were bright and fresh in the pavilion." To Brighton, therefore, the bride and bridegroom departed, Diana attended by a maid, an appanage which the captain had insisted upon. Poor Diana was sorely puzzled as to what she should find for the maid to do when her hair had been dressed early in the morning, and her costume laid out in state for the day. "I think I must buy some handkerchiefs for her to hem," she said to Gustave. "It will be quite dreadful for her to have nothing to do all day long." The weather was warm and bright. The sea danced and sparkled under the windows. Gustave was always in the same happy frame of mind. An elegant landau had been secured for the period of their visit, and a pair of capital horses carried them out on long and pleasant expeditions to the pretty Sussex villages, or across the broad bare downs, beyond which the sea stretched blue and bright. In the evening, when the lamp was lighted and the urn hissed gaily, Diana felt that she and her husband were at home. It was the first home she had known, the first time she had been sole mistress and centre of a household. She looked back at all the old desolation, the dreary shifting from lodging to lodging, the degradation, the self-abasement, the dull apathy of despair. And then she looked across at her husband as he lounged in his easy-chair, contemplating her with dreamy adoring eye, in a kind of lazy worship, and she knew that for this man she was the centre of the universe, the very keystone in the arch of life. She stretched out her hand to him with a smile, and he pressed it fondly to his lips. There were twinkling jewels upon the slender fingers, for the prettiest shop in Brighton, the brightest shop in Brighton, had been ransacked that morning by the fond, frivolous, happy husband, as pleased to bedeck his wife as a child to dress her last new doll. "How can I ever be worthy of so much affection, Gustave?" she exclaimed as he kissed the twinkling fingers. And it did seem indeed to her that for this free gift of love she could never render a sufficient recompense. "Thou wilt make Côte-Noire a home," he said. "Thou knowest not how I have sighed for a home. This room, with the lamplight shining on thy face, and thy white hands moving about the teacups, and thy sweet smile, which greets me every now and then when thou lookest by here, it is more of home than I have ever known since I left Beaubocage, that modest dwelling where lived those two angels of kindness, my aunt and my grandmother." In one of those long pleasant drives to a distant village nestling under the lee of a steep hill, the husband and wife had much serious talk about the position of the former with reference to the Haygarth estate. The result of that conversation was shown in a letter which Charlotte Hawkehurst received the next day from her friend Diana Lenoble. Albion Hotel, Brighton. Ever dear Lotta, Gustave and I have discussed the Haygarth business with great satisfaction to ourselves, since it transpired in the course of our conversation that we are both of one mind in the matter. It is agreed between us that, as he is very well off already, and as he never hoped or expected to inherit a fortune from his maternal ancestor, it is only just that he should divide this unlooked-for wealth with his dear cousin, whose claim to that inheritance he recognises as equal to his own, the mere fact of seniority making only a legal and not a moral difference in the degree of relationship to the Reverend John Haygarth. Do you understand, darling? You are to have half this money. My husband will not step in between you and good fortune. I cannot tell you how happy this determination of Gustave's has made me. I felt myself in a manner base and ungrateful when I thought I was to share wealth that might have been yours. But I ought to have better understood the justice of my husband's mind. And now, dearest, all will be arranged very simply. Gustave will come to London and see his lawyers, and execute some kind of deed, and the whole affair will be settled. We have had some charming drive, etc., etc. Here the young bride branched off into a description of the simple pleasures of their honeymoon holiday. This letter was answered by Valentine Hawkehurst in person. He came down to Brighton to thank his friends for their generous desire to enrich his wife, and to decline, on her part, any share in John Haygarth's wealth. It was in vain that Gustave and Diana argued the point. Mr. Hawkehurst was fixed as fate. "Believe me, it is better as it is," he said. "Charlotte and I have arrived at this conviction with all due thought and deliberation. We are both young, and the world is all before us. There is much in the past that I have to redeem, as Diana well knows. It is better that I should fight the battle of life unaided, and rise from the ranks by right of my merit as a soldier. If ever we have need of help, if ever I find myself breaking down, you may be sure that it is to you I shall come. By and by, if Providence gives me children to work for, I will refuse no bounty that you may bestow on them. Their future may be rendered secure by your generosity, if you please, Lenoble. They will be your kindred. But for an alien like myself there is no discipline so wholesome as honest hard work. I am as rich as John Milton when he set up school in St. Bride's churchyard." To this resolution Mr. Hawkehurst adhered with a gentle firmness. "Thou art chivalrous like Don Quixote," said Gustave Lenoble. "But it shall be as thou wouldest. Touch there." He offered his hand, which the other grasped with all heartiness. "I will be godfather to thy little first one, and I will settle on him £10,000 before he cuts his first tooth," said Gustave decisively. End of chapter 5. Read by Celine Major. Book the 10th, Chapter 6, of Charlotte's Inheritance. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Celine Major. Charlotte's Inheritance by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. Chapter 6. Beyond the Veil. Diana and her husband did not linger long at Brighton. They went back to town in time to see the last of that old wayfarer whose troubled journey came to so peaceful an ending. It was a very calm haven in which this battered old privateer lay at anchor after life's tempestuous course. But to the captain himself it seemed a hard thing that he should not have been permitted one brief cruise upon that summer sea which danced so gaily beneath the keel of the Lenoble's prosperous bark. "We have shared adversity, my love," he said sadly, when he talked with his daughter in the last few days. But your prosperity I am to have no share in. Well, I suppose I have no right to complain. My life has been an erring one. But poverty is the most vicious companion that a man can consort with. If I had come into 6,000 or 7,000 a year, I might have been as starch in my notions as a bishop. But I have been obliged to live, Diana. That was the primary necessity, and I learnt to accommodate myself to it. That he had erred the captain was very ready to acknowledge. That he had sinned deeply, and had much need to repent himself of his iniquity, he was very slow to perceive. But sometimes, in the still watches of the night, when the faint lamplight on the shadowy wall was more gloomy than darkness, when the nurse, hired to assist his own man in these last days, dozed in her comfortable chair, the truth came home to his shallow soul, and Horatio Paget knew that he had been indeed a sinner, and very vile among sinners. Then, for a moment, the veil of self-deception was lifted, and he saw his past life as it had really been: selfish, dishonourable, cruel beyond measure in reckless injury of others. For a moment the awful book was opened, and the sinner saw the fearful sum set against his name. "What can wipe out the dread account?" he asked himself. "Is there such a thing as forgiveness for a selfish, useless life? A life which is one long offence against God and man?" In these long wakeful nights the dying man thought much of his wife. The sweet tender face came back to him, with its mournful wondering look. He knew now how his falsehoods and dishonours had wounded and oppressed that gentle soul. He remembered how often she had pleaded for the right, and how he had ridiculed her arguments, and set at naught her tender pleadings. He had fancied her in a manner inimical to himself when she urged the cause of some angry creditor or meek deluded landlady. Now, with the light that is not upon earth or sea shining in the picture of his past career, he could see and understand things as he had never seen or understood them before. He knew now that it was for his own sake that faithful and devoted wife had pleaded, his own interest that had been near to her pitying heart, as well as the interest of bakers and butchers, landladies and tailors. "She might have made a good man of me, if I had let her have her way," he thought to himself. "I know that she is in heaven. Will she plead for me, I wonder, at the foot of the great throne? I used to laugh at her bad English, or fly in a passion with her sometimes, poor soul, when I wanted her to pass for a lady, and she broke down outrageously. But there, her voice will be heard when mine appeals in vain. Dear soul! I wonder who taught her to be so pure and unselfish, and trusting and faithful. She was a Christian without knowing it. I thank thee, O Father, Lord of heaven and earth, because thou hast hid these things from the wise and prudent, and hast revealed them unto babes." He thought of his wife's lonely deathbed, and compared it with his own. For him there was luxury. By him watched a devoted and all-forgiving daughter, a generous friend and son-in-law. All that could be done to soothe the painful descent was done for him. For her there had been nothing but loneliness and sorrow. "But she might be certain of a speedy welcome in a better home," thought Horatio, "and I? Ah, dear kind creature, there the difference was all in her favour." As the closing scene grew nearer, he thought more and more of his gentle low-born wife, whose hold upon him in life had been so slender, whose memory had occupied until now so insignificant a place in his mind. His daughter watched him unceasingly in the last 2 days and nights. His mind wandered. On the day of his death he mistook Diana for that long-lost companion. "I have not been a kind husband, Mary, my dear," he faltered. "But the world has been hard upon me. Debts, difficulties, crack regiment, expensive mess, set of gamblers, no pity on a young man without fortune, force of example. Tied a millstone round my wretched neck before I was 21 years of age." Later, when the doctor had felt his pulse for the last time, he cried out suddenly, "I have made a statement of my affairs. The liabilities are numerous, the assets nil. But I rely on the clemency of this court." These were his last words. He sank into a kind of stupor betwixt sleeping and waking. and in this he died. End of chapter 6. Recorded by Celine Major. Book the 10th, Chapter 7 of Charlotte's Inheritance. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Celine Major. Charlotte's Inheritance by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. Chapter 7. Better Than Gold. The little fleet of paper boats which Mr. Sheldon had pioneered so skilfully over the commercial seas came to grief very soon after the disappearance of the admiral. A bill drawn upon the Honduras Mahogany Company Limited was the first to reach maturity. The bill was referred to the drawer. The drawer was not to be found. "I have not seen Sheldon for the last fortnight," Mr. Orcott informed the gentleman who brought him the document. "Out of business for a fortnight?" "He has not been in business for a month. His stepdaughter has been very ill, at death's door, and all that kind of thing. And my governor was awfully cut up about it. There used to be a couple of doctors at the house every day, and no end of fuss. I took Sheldon his letters and managed matters for him here, and so on. And one fine morning my young lady runs off and gets married on the quiet, so I suspect there was a good deal of shamming about the illness, and those old fogies, the doctors, winked at it. Between them all, I fancy Sheldon was completely sold, and he has turned savage and gone off somewhere in the sulks." "I wish he had chosen any other time for his sulks," said the holder of the bill. "My partner and I have discounted several acceptances for him. He gave us liberal terms, and we considered any paper of his as safe as a Bank of England note, and now this confounded bill comes back to us through our bankers, noted, 'Refer to drawer.' A most unpleasant thing, you know, and very inconsiderate of Sheldon to leave us in such a fix." "He has forgotten the bill, I suppose," said Mr. Orcott. "Well, but you see, really now, a business man ought not to forget that kind of thing. And so Miss Halliday has made a runaway match, has she? I remember seeing her when I dined at Bayswater. An uncommonly fine girl. And she has gone and thrown herself away upon some penniless scapegrace, most likely. Now, by the by, how about this Honduras company, Mr. Orcott? They don't seem to have any London offices." "I believe not. We've some of their prospectuses somewhere about, I think. Would you like to see one?" "I should, very much." Mr. Orcott opened 2 or 3 drawers, and after some little trouble produced the required document. It was a very flourishing prospectus, setting forth the enormous benefits to be derived by shareholders from the profitable dealings of the company. Some good high-sounding names figured in the list of directors, and the chairman was Captain H. N. Cromie Paget. The prospectus looked well enough, but the holder of Mr. Sheldon's dishonoured bill was not able to derive much comfort from high-sounding phrases and high-sounding names. "I'll go down to Bayswater and see if I can hear anything of your governor," he said to Mr. Orcott. "He was not there yesterday when I called, and his servants could tell me nothing of his whereabouts," the young Yorkshireman said very coolly. "Indeed!" cried the holder of the dishonoured bill in some alarm. "Now really that is not right. A business man ought not to do that kind of thing." He called a cab and drove to the lawn. There was the smart Gothic villa, with its pointed gables and florid chimneys and oriel windows, and in the Tudor casements of the ground floor appeared the bills of a West End auctioneer, announcing in large letters that the lease of this charming mansion, together with the nearly new furniture, linen, books, china, plate, carefully selected proof prints, after distinguished modern artists, small cellar of choice wines, etc., 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 would be disposed of by the auction on the following day. Mr. Sheldon's victim went into the house, where he found some men preparing for the forthcoming sale. "What is the meaning of all this?" he asked, aghast. "A bill of sale, sir. Messrs. Naphtali and Zabulon." This was enough. The holder of the bill went back to the city. Another bill came due on the following day, and before the members of the Stock Exchange took their luncheon, it was known that Philip Sheldon's credit was among the things of the past. "I always thought he was out of his depth," said one set of talkers. "He was the last man I should have expected to see come to grief," said another set of talkers. On settling day came the awful proclamation. Philip Sheldon had absconded, and would not meet his differences. On the same day came a terrible revelation to Mr. George Sheldon, of Gray's Inn, solicitor, genealogist, and pedigree hunter. The first official step in the advancement of Gustave Lenoble's claim against the Crown was taken by Messrs. Dashwood and Vernon, the solicitors of Whitehall; and George Sheldon discovered that between Charlotte Hawkehurst and the Haygarth estate there stood a prior claimant, whereby all his toil, trouble, cost out of pocket, and wear and tear of body and mind had been wasted. "It is enough to make a man go and cut his throat," cried George, in his first savage sense of utter disappointment. He went into his slovenly bedroom and took out one of his razors, and felt the corrugated surface of the left side of his neck meditatively. But the razor was blunt, and the corrugated surface seemed very tough and unmanageable; so George Sheldon decided that this kind of operation was an affair which might be deferred. He heard the next day that his brother was non est, and, in his own phraseology, that there was a pretty kettle of fish in the city. "Upon my word, Phil and I seem to have brought our pigs to a very nice market," he said. "I dare say, wherever that fellow has gone, he has carried a well-lined purse with him. But I wouldn't have his conscience for all the wealth of the Rothschilds. It's bad enough to see Tom Halliday's face as I see it sometimes. What must it be to him?" A little more than a year after this, and the yellow corn was waving on the fertile plains of Normandy, fruit ripening in orchards on hillside and in valley, merry holiday folks splashing and dabbling in the waves that wash the yellow sands of Dieppe, horses coming to grief in Norman steeplechases, desperate gamesters losing their francs and half-francs in all kinds of frivolous games in the Dieppe établissement, and yonder, in the heart of Normandy, beyond the tall steeples of Rouen, a happy family assembled at the Château Côtenoir. One happy family. Two happy families, rather, but so closely united by the bonds of love and friendship as to seem indeed one. Here are Gustave Lenoble and his young wife Diana, with two tall slender damsels by their side; and here is Valentine Hawkehurst, the successful young scribbler, with his fair young wife Charlotte; and out on the terrace yonder are two nurses walking with two babies, at that early, and, to some minds, obnoxious stage of babyhood in which a perpetual rocking and pacing to and fro, and swaying backwards and forwards in the air, is necessary for the preservation of anything approaching tranquillity. But to the minds of the two young mothers and the two proud fathers, these small creatures, in their long white robes, seemed something too bright for earth. The united ages of the babies do not amount to 6 months, but the mothers have counted every gradual stage of these young lives, and to both it seems as if there has been no time in which the children were not, with so firm a hold have they possessed themselves of every thought in the foolish maternal mind, of every impulse in the weak maternal heart. Mrs. Hawkehurst has brought her son to see his Aunt Diana; for Diana has insisted upon assuming that relationship by letters patent, as it were. Madame Lenoble's baby is a daughter, and this fact in itself seems to the two friends to be a special interposition of Providence. "Would it not be delightful if they should grow up to love each other and marry?" exclaimed Diana; and Charlotte agreed with her that such an event in the future did indeed seem a manner foreshadowed by the conduct of the infants in the present. "He takes notice of her already," she exclaimed, looking out at the little creature in white muslin robes held up against the warm blue sky. "See, they are cooing at each other. I am sure that must be cooing." And then the two mothers went out upon the sunny terrace walk and fondly contemplated these domestic treasures, until the domestic treasures were seized with some of the inexplicable throes and mysterious agonies of early babyhood, and had to be borne off shrieking to their nurseries. "Dear angel!" said Gustave, of his little last one, "she has the very shriek of Clarisse here, poignant and penetrating, until to drown the heart. Dost thou figure to thyself that thy voice was penetrating as that, my beautiful, in the time?" He kissed his beautiful, and she ran off to join the procession following the two babies, alarmed nurses, distracted mammas, shrieking infants, anxious damsels. "C'est un vrai tourbillon," as Gustave remarked to his companion Valentine Hawkehurst. "These women, how they love their children! What of saints, what of madonnas, what of angels?" Whereupon he spouted Victor Hugo. "Lorsque l'enfant paraît, le cercle de famille applaudit à grands cris. son doux regard qui brille fait briller tous les yeux. Et les plus tristes fronts, les plus souillés peut-être, se dérident soudain à voir l'enfant paraître, innocent et joyeux. All things had gone well for M. Lenoble. His direct descent from Matthew Haygarth, the father of the intestate, had been proved to the satisfaction of Crown lawyers and High Court of Chancery, and he had been in due course placed in possession of the reverend intestate's estate, to the profit and pleasure of his solicitors and M. Fleurus, and to the unspeakable aggravation of George Sheldon, who washed his hands at once and forever of all genealogical research, and fell back in an embittered and angry spirit upon the smaller profits to be derived from petty transactions in the bill discounting line, and a championship of penniless sufferers of all classes, from a damsel who considered herself jilted by a fickle swain, in proof of whose inconstancy she could produce documentary evidence of the pork-chop and tomato-sauce order, to a pedestrian who knocked his head against a projecting shutter in the Strand, and straightway walked home to Holloway to lay himself up for a 12-month in a state of mental and bodily incapacity requiring large pecuniary redress from the owner of the fatal shutter. To this noble protection of the rights of the weak did George Sheldon devote his intellect; and when malicious enemies stigmatized these quixotic endeavours as speculative actions, or when, in the breaking down of some oppressed damsel's cause by reason of the slender evidence afforded by some reticent lover's epistolary effusions, unjust judges told him that he ought to be ashamed of himself for bringing such an action, the generous attorney no doubt took consolation from an approving conscience, and went forth from that court, to look for other oppressed damsels or injured wayfarers, erect and unshaken. Some little profit Mr. Sheldon of Gray's Inn did derive from the Haygarth estate, for at the request of Gustave Lenoble Messrs. Dashwood and Vernon sent him a cheque for £1,000, as the price of those early investigations which had set the artful captain upon the right track. He wrote a ceremoniously grateful letter to Gustave Lenoble on receiving this honorarium. It is always well to be grateful for benefits received from a rich man. But in the depths of his heart he execrated the fortunate inheritor of the Haygarthian thousands. Mr. Hawkehurst was not quite so vehement in the expression of his feelings as that lively Celt, Gustave. But deep in his heart there was a sense of happiness no less pure and exalted. Providence had given him more than he had ever dared to hope, not John Haygarth's thousands, not a life of luxurious idleness, and dinner-giving, and Derby days, and boxes on the grand tier, and carriage-horses at 500 guineas a pair, not a palace in Belgravia, and a shooting-box in the Highlands, and a villa at Cowes, not these things in which he would once have perceived the summum bonum, but a fair price for his labour, a dear young wife, a tranquil home. Nor had his researches among the dusty records of the departed Haygarths been profitless in a pecuniary sense to himself. Gustave Lenoble insisted that he should accept the honorarium of £3,000 which had been promised by George Sheldon as the reward of his success. "Captain Paget would never have been put on the right track if he had not filched your secrets from you," said the son and heir of Susan Meynell. "It is to your researches, in the first place, that I owe this inheritance, and you cannot refuse to accept the agreed price of your labour." Valentine did not refuse this fairly earned reward, nor did he oppose the settlement which Gustave made in favour of Charlotte's infant son. It seemed to him only just that some share of the heritage should fall to the descendant of poor Susan's younger sister and faithful friend. With this capital of £3,000 comfortably invested in consols, and with the interest of that sum of £10,000 settled on his infant son, Mr. Hawkehurst began the world, in his new character of a husband and a father, very pleasantly. Of his literary career very little need be said here. He was yet at the beginning of the long dusty road that leads to the Temple of Fame. It is enough to state that he found the dusty high road rather difficult walking, and that he was pelted with more mud, flung by nameless assailants hidden behind the hedges, than he had anticipated when he set out upon the first stage of his journey. Happily, he found pleasant fellow-travellers, and kindly encouragement from an indulgent public, and was thus able to accept the mud which bespattered his garments in a very placid spirit, and to make light of all obstacles in the great highway. The cottage at Wimbledon was no longer a dream. It was a pleasant reality, the pride and delight of Mrs. Sheldon and Ann Woolper. It was a picturesque dwelling-place, half cottage, half villa, situated on the broad high road from London to Kingston, with all the woodland of Richmond Park to be seen from the windows at the back. Only a wall divided Mr. Hawkehurst's gardens from the coverts of the Queen. It was like a royal domain, Charlotte said, whereupon her husband insisted that it should be christened by the name of a royal dwelling, and so called it Charlottenburg. Mr. Hawkehurst had secured his delightful abode for a considerable term of years, and upon the furnishing and decoration of the pretty rustic rooms Charlotte and he lavished unmeasured care. The delicious excitement of "picking up," or, in more elegant parlance, collecting, was to these two happy people an inexhaustible source of pleasure. Every eccentric little table, every luxurious chair, had its special history, and had been the subject of negotiation and diplomacy that might have sufficed a Burleigh in the reorganization of Western Europe. The little Dresden and Vienna cups and saucers in the maple cabinet had been every one bought from a different dealer. The figures on the mantelpiece were old Chelsea, of a quality that would have excited the envy of a Bernal or a Bonn, and had only fallen to the proud possessors by a sequence of fortuitous circumstances, the history of which was almost as thrilling as the story of Bonar's diamond necklace. The curtains in the drawing-room had draped the portière of the lovely Lady Blessington, and had been bought for a song by Valentine Hawkehurst, after passing through the hands of brokers and dealers innumerable. The tapestry-covered Louis XIV chairs had belonged to Madame de Sévigné, and had furnished that dull country house whence she wrote the liveliest letters extant to her disreputable cousin, Bussy, Count of Babutin. These inestimable treasures had been picked up by Mr. and Mrs. Hawkehurst from a bric-a-brac merchant in a little court at the back of la Rue Vivienne, whither the young couple had gone arm in arm to choose a bonnet on their first pleasure trip to Paris. The clock in the modest dining-room had been secured from the repository of the same merchant, and was warranted to have sounded the last domestic hours of Maximilien Robespierre in his humble lodging chez le menuisier. The inkstand into which Mr. Hawkehurst dipped his rapid pen had served the literary career of Voltaire. The blotting-book on which he wrote had been used by Balzac. To the plausible fictions of the second-hand dealer Mr. and Mrs. Hawkehurst lent willing ears, and it seemed to them as if these associations, for which they had paid somewhat dearly, imparted a new grace to their home. The arrangement and superintendence of all these treasures gave poor Georgie endless pleasure and employment. But in her heart of hearts she believed in the prim splendours of the dismantled lawn as much superior to these second-hand objects of art and upholstery. Nor did Anne Woolper regard the Chelsea figures and Dresden teacups and old black Albert Durer engravings as anything better than an innocent eccentricity on the part of the master of the house, for the saving of whose purse she managed and economized as faithfully as she had done for that lost master whereof the memory was so bitter. It will be seen, therefore, that Mr. Hawkehurst, with a wife, a mother-in-law, and a faithful old servant, was likely to be well taken care of, a little spoiled perhaps by much cherishing, but carefully guarded from all those temptations which are supposed to assail the bachelor man of letters, toiling alone and neglected in Temple chambers. For him the days passed in a pleasant monotony of constant labour, lightened always by the thought of those for whom he worked, cheered ever by the fond hope of future fame. He was no longer a bookmaker. He had written a book, the proceeds of which had enabled him to furnish the Wimbledon villa, and he was engaged in writing a second book, the fruits whereof would secure the needs of the immediate future. He had insured his life for a considerable amount, and had shown himself in all things prudent to a degree that verged upon Philistinism. But the policies taken out on Charlotte's life by Mr. Sheldon had been suffered to lapse. Valentine would have no money staked on that dear head. The steed which Charlotte had desired for her husband's pleasure, the library which she had catalogued so often, were yet among the delights of the future. But life has lost half its brightness when there is no unfulfilled desire left to the dreamer, and the horse which Mr. Hawkehurst was to ride in time to come, and the noble library which he was to collect, were the pleasant themes of Charlotte's conversation very often, as she and her husband walked on the heights of Wimbledon in the twilight, when his day's work was done. These twilight walks were the happy holidays of his life, and a part of his liberal education. He told his wife everything, every literary scheme, every fancy, every shadowy outline of future work, every new discovery in the boundless realms of bookland. His enthusiasm, his hero-worship, his setting up of one favourite and knocking down of another, his unchristian pleasure in that awful slating of poor Jones in this week's Saturday, or the flaying alive of Robinson in the Bond Street Backbiter. In a word, his "shop" never became wearisome to Charlotte. She listened always with a like rapture and sympathy. She worshipped his favourites of Bookland. She welcomed his friends and fellow workers with unvarying sweetness. She devised and superintended the fitting up of a smoking room that was perfectly paradisiacal, a glimpse of the Alhambra in miniature, and that obnoxious dish, the cold shoulder, was never served in Mr. Hawkehurst's dwelling. So sweet a wife, so pleasant a home, popularized the institution of matrimony among the young writer's bachelor friends, and that much abused and cruelly maligned member of the human race, the mother-in-law, was almost rehabilitated by Mrs. Sheldon's easy good nature and evident regard for the interests of her daughter's husband. And after all the groping among dry-as-dust records of a bygone century, after all the patient following of those faint traces on the sands of time left by the feet of Matthew Haygarth, this was Charlotte's inheritance, a heart whose innocence and affection made home a kind of earthly paradise, and gave to life's commonest things a charm that all the gold ever found in California could not have imparted to them. This was Charlotte's inheritance, the tender, unselfish nature of the Haygarths and Hallidays, and thus dowered, her husband would not have exchanged her for the wealthiest heiress whose marriage was ever chronicled in court circular or court journal. End of Chapter 7. Read by Celine Major. Book the 10th, Chapter 8 of Charlotte's Inheritance. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Celine Major. Charlotte's Inheritance by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. Chapter 8. Lost Sight of. A year and a half had passed since the disappearance of Philip Sheldon from the circle in which he had been considered a person of some importance. The repudiation of those bills by which he had sustained his exhausted credit, or rather the discovery that the companies upon which the bills pretended to be drawn were of all shadows the most shadowy, had brought consternation upon many, and ruin upon some. Bitter and unmeasured were the terms in which city men spoke of that Phil Sheldon with whom they had eaten the sacred bait, and quaffed the social moselle in the taverns of Greenwich and Blackwall. There is a saying current on the Stock Exchange to the effect that the man who fails, and disappears from his fellows behind a curtain of commercial cloud, is sure to return sooner or later to his old circle, with a moustache and a brougham. For Philip Sheldon there was, however, no coming back. The moustache and the brougham of the chastened and penitent defaulter were not for him. By his deliberate and notorious dishonour he had shut the door against the possibility of return. It may be supposed that the defaulter knew this, for he did not come back, and since he had no lack of moral courage, he would scarcely have refrained from showing himself once more in his old haunts, if it had been possible for him to face the difficulties of his position. Time passed, and there came no tidings of the missing man, though a detective was dispatched to America in search of him by one vengeful sufferer among the many victims of the fictitious bills of exchange. It was supposed that he must inevitably go to America, and thither went his pursuer, but with no result except the expenditure of money and the further exasperation of the vengeful sufferer. "What will you do with him if you get him?" asked a philosophical friend of the sufferer. "He has nothing to surrender. Zabulon had a bill of sale on his furniture." "Furniture!" cried the infuriated victim. "I don't want his furniture. I want his flesh and bones. I want to shut him up in Dartmoor prison, or to get him 20 years' hard labour at Portland Island." "That sort of man would get a ticket of leave in less than 12 months," replied the philosophic friend. "I'm afraid you are only throwing good money after bad." The event proved this gentleman but too able a seer. In the monster city of New York, Philip Sheldon had disappeared like a single drop of water flung upon the Atlantic Ocean. There was no trace of him. Too intangible for the grasp of international law, he melted into the mass of humanity, only one struggler the more in the great army perpetually fighting life's desperate battle. From among all those who had known him this man had utterly vanished, and not one sigh of regret followed him in his unknown wanderings. Not one creature amongst all those who had taken his hand and given him friendly greeting thought of him kindly, or cared to know whither he went or how he prospered. He had not left in the house that had sheltered him for years so much as a dog to whine at his door, or listen for his returning footstep. This fact, if he had known it or considered it, would have troubled him very little. He had played his game for a certain stake, and had lost it. This he felt, and cursed his own too cautious play as the cause of his defeat. That there were higher stakes for which he might have played an easier game was a fact that never occurred to him. In his philosophy there was indeed nothing higher given to the hopes of man than worldly success, and a dull, cold, prosperous life spent among prosperous acquaintance. He was gone, and those who remembered him most keenly, Valentine Hawkehurst, Diana Paget, Anne Woolper, remembered him with a shudder. The old Yorkshire woman thought of him sometimes as she bent over the little muslin-bedecked cradle, where the hope of the Hawkehursts slumbered, and looked round fearfully in the gloaming, half expecting to see his dreaded face glower upon her, dark and threatening, from between the curtains of the window. It was a belief of all ancient races, nay, indeed, a belief still current amongst modern nations, that it is not given to man to behold the beings of another world and live. The Arab who meets a phantom in the desert goes home to his tent to die. He knows that the hand of doom is upon him. He has seen that upon which, for mortal eyes, it is fatal to look. And it is thus in some measure with those who are admitted within the dark precincts of murder's dread sanctuary. Not swiftly does the curtain fall which has once been lifted from the hidden horrors of that ghastly temple. The revelations of an utterly wicked soul leave a lasting impress upon the mind which unwillingly becomes recipient of those awful secrets. The circumstances of Tom Halliday's death and of Charlotte's illness were not to be forgotten by Anne Woolper. The shadow of that dark, cruel face, which had lain upon her bosom for 40 years before, haunted many a peaceful hour of her quiet old age. Her ignorance, and that faint tinge of superstition which generally accompanies ignorance, exaggerated the terror of those dark memories. The thought that Philip Sheldon still lived, still had the power to plot and plan evil against the innocent, was an ever-present source of terror for her. She could not understand that such an element could exist among the forces of evil without fatal result to someone. It seemed to her as if a devil were at large, and there could be neither peace nor security until the evil spirit was exorcised, the baneful presence laid in nethermost depths of unfathomable sea. These feelings and these fears would scarcely have arisen in the old woman's breast, had she alone been subject to the possible plottings of that evil nature. For herself, she had little fear. Her span of life was nearly ended. Very few were the sands that had yet to run. And, for her own sake, she would have cared little if some rough hand had spilt them untimely. But a new interest in life had been given to Mrs. Woolper, just as life drew near its close. That peerless child, the son and heir of the Hawkehursts, had been entrusted to the old woman's care, and this infant she loved with an affection much more intense than that which had once made Philip Sheldon so dear to her. It was by the cradle of this much-treasured child that Anne Woolper nursed her fear of her old master. She knew that he had been counter-plotted and beaten ignominiously in that deadly game which he had played so boldly. And she asked herself whether he was the man to submit to such utter defeat without any effort to revenge himself upon those who had helped to compass his failure. On that night, when Charlotte Halliday had lain between life and death, suffering on the one hand from the effects of a prolonged and gradual course of poison, on the other from the violent measures taken to eliminate that poisonous element from her system, on that night, when the precious life yet trembled in the balance, Anne Woolper had seen murderous looks in the face of the man whom she dared boldly to defy, and who knew, in that hour, that his ghastly plot was discovered. Even now, secure in a haven of safety, she could not forget that baneful look in Philip Sheldon's eyes. She could not find perfect rest while she knew not where that man might be, or what mischief he might be plotting against those she loved. Her fears showed themselves in many ways. When she read of dark and vengeful deeds in her newspaper, she thought of her old master, and how, in such or such an act, his fatal hand might reveal itself. He might lie in wait for Valentine some night on the dark road between Charlottenburgh and the distant railway station. She could fancy the young wife's agony of terror as the night wore on, and her husband did not return. The unspeakable horror that would come over all that happy household when the news came that its young master had been found on the lonely road, slain by some unknown hand. Open utterance to her fears she was too wise to give, but she warned Mr. Hawkehurst of the dangers on that dark road, and besought him to arm himself with a trusty bludgeon wherewith to meet and vanquish any chance assailant. Valentine laughed at her anxious warning, but when Charlotte took up the cry he was fain to content her by the purchase of a sturdy stick, which he swung cheerily to and fro as he walked homewards in the gloaming, planning a chapter in his new book, and composing powerful and eloquent sentences which eluded his mental grasp when he tried to reduce his evening reverie to pen and ink. When the air blows fresh across the common, and the distant lights twinkle, and the bright stars peep out in the pale yellow sky, my language flows as it never does when I sit at my desk, Lotta," he said to his wife. "I feel myself a Swift or a Junius out there, equal to the tackling of any social question that ever arose upon this earth, from the wood halfpence to the policy of the American taxation and triennial elections. At home I am only Valentine Hawkehurst, with an ever-present consciousness that so many pages of copy are required from me within a given time, and that my son and heir is cutting his teeth, and making more fuss about it than I ever made about my teeth, and that the man about the water rate is waiting to see me, please, and is desperately anxious about making up his books, and that I have the dearest wife in Christendom, who opens my door, and puts her pretty head into my room once in half an hour to see how I am getting on, or to ask whether I want any more coals, or to borrow my ink to make up her washing book." "You mean, sir, that I prevent your becoming a Junius?" cried Charlotte, with an enchanting moo. "Yes, dear. I begin to understand why Swift kept his poor ill-used wife at a respectful distance. She would have made him too happy if he had allowed her to be on the premises. She would have given the cruel indignation no chance of lacerating his heart. And such writing, as Swift's, is only produced by a man whose heart is so lacerated. No, my darling, I shall never be a Swift or a Junius while your pretty head is thrust into my room once or twice an hour. But I may hope to be something better, if bright eyes can inspire bright thoughts, and innocent smiles give birth to pleasant fancies." Upon this there was the usual little demonstration of affection between this young couple, and Charlotte praised her husband as the most brilliant and admirable of men, after which pleasing flattery she favoured him with a little interesting information about the baby's last tooth, and the contumacious behaviour of the new housemaid, between whom and Mrs. Woolper there had been a species of disagreement, which the Yorkshire woman described as a "stand further." Thus occupied in simple pleasures and simple cares, the lives of Mr. and Mrs. Hawkehurst went on, untroubled by any fear of that crime-burdened wretch whose image haunted the dreams and meditations of Ann Woolper. For these two Mr. Sheldon was numbered among the dead. To Charlotte the actual truth had never been revealed, but she had been, in the course of time, given to understand that her stepfather had committed some unpardonable sin, which must for ever separate him from herself and her mother. She had been told as much as this, and had been told that she must seek to know no more. To this she submitted without questioning. "I am very sorry for him," she said, "and for mamma." She concluded that the unpardonable offence must needs have been some sin against her mother, some long-hidden infidelity, brought suddenly to light, with all the treachery and falsehood involved therein. She never mentioned her stepfather after this, but in her prayers the sinner was not forgotten. End of Chapter 8. Read by Celine Major. Book the 10th, Chapter 9, of Charlotte's Inheritance. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Celine Major. Charlotte's Inheritance by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. Chapter 9. Eteocles and Polynices. George Sheldon went his ways, picking up as good a living as he could from that chivalrous assertion of the rights of the weak, which has been already described, and the thought of his brother's sin-burdened soul troubled him very little. He did think of Tom Halliday, for that last grasp of the honest Yorkshireman's hand, that last look in his old friend's face, were haunting memories which this sharp practitioner had found himself powerless to exorcise. If his brother, after an absence of many years in the remote regions of the East Indies, had come home to his fatherland with a colossal fortune, and the reputation of having strangled a few natives during the process of amassing that fortune, George Sheldon would have welcomed the returning wanderer, and would, in his own parlance, have swallowed the natives. A few niggers more or less sent untimely to Gehenna would have seemed scarcely sufficient cause for quarrel with a fraternal and liberally disposed millionaire. But the circumstances of Tom Halliday's death had brought all the horror of crime and treachery home to the spectator of that deliberate assassination, and had produced such an impression as no other circumstances could on so hard a nature. It was some satisfaction to George Sheldon to know that his old friend's daughter had found a happy home, and he was apt to take some credit for his own share in his brother's discomfiture. He met Valentine sometimes in the course of his peregrinations in the neighbourhood of the British Museum, and the greeting between the two men was sufficiently cordial. But Mr. Hawkehurst did not invite his old employer to Charlottenburgh, and George was able to comprehend that to that household no one bearing the name of Sheldon could be a welcome visitor. He jogged on comfortably enough in his own way, living in his chambers, and consorting with a few chosen friends and kindred spirits of the jolly good fellow class, whom he met at an old established tavern in the west central district, and in whose society, and the society of the subscription ground in the Farringdon Road, he found the summum bonum in the way of social intercourse. He did a little speculation upon the turf, and discounted the bills of needy bookmakers, or bought up their bad debts, and thereby gained introductions to the noble patrons of the humble scums, and pushed his business into new grooves. He had no idea that such an existence was in any way ignoble. Nay, indeed, when he had paid his rent, and his clerk, and his laundress, and his tavern score, and stood glasses round amongst his friends, he lighted his cigar, and thrust his hands into the depths of his pockets, and paced the flags of Holborn, happy in the belief that he had performed the whole duty of man. "There are men whose business obliges them to keep up an establishment, and go to church twice a day, and all that kind of thing," he said, "and I dare say they find it pay. My clients don't care a doit where I live, and how I spend my Sundays, and I'd rather have £5 a week and my liberty than the best family connection in the fields." The fate of that wretched man, who had dropped out of his old circle and vanished no one knew whither, in no manner disturbed the peace of George Sheldon. "Take my word for it, that gentleman has fallen on his feet," he said on the only occasion when the fate of Philip was discussed by Valentine and himself. "He's doing well enough, somewhere or other, you may depend. But I don't think he'll ever be able to show his nose in London after those bill transactions. There's a very strong feeling against him on 'Change. He's looked upon as a discredit to the order, and that sort of thing, you see. It isn't often a member of the House goes to the bad like that. No, I don't think Phil will ever show himself in London again, but such a man as that can always find a platform somewhere." "And go on to the end of his days unpunished, I suppose," remarked Mr. Hawkehurst, with some bitterness. "Well, yes. I don't see what's to touch him in the future. Of course he could be dropped upon for those bills, if he came in the way of being dropped upon, but, as I said before, he's too deep a card for that." Thus did George Sheldon dismiss the subject. That his brother was an exile for life from his native land he did not doubt, but he took it for granted that in whatever distant spot of earth Philip had found a refuge, he would there contrive to prosper and to show a bold front in the city of his adoption. This belief Mr. Sheldon of Gray's Inn cherished until one snowy Christmas Eve, a year and a half after that event, or series of events, which the lawyer briefly designated the burst-up at Bayswater. Bleak and bitter was that December, a December not long gone by. The heart of the prosperous British nation melted as the heart of one man. The columns of the Zeus and diurnal Hermes, the Flag and the Hesper, overflowed with the record of subscriptions to charity funds, and the leaders of the morning journals all preached the same kindly sermon on the same Christian text. Thick lay the snow upon the housetops, thick and slab, the greasy slush upon the pavements of crowded thoroughfares. Merry the rogues and ragamuffins of the great city. The ideal Christmas of our dreams seemed to have come at last, and the heart of every true Briton rejoiced. While skaters in the parks made merry, and cabmen demanded fabulous sums of helpless wayfarers, and luckless, overworked, underfed horses stumbled and fell at every turn, and the familiar steep of Holborn was dangerous as Alpine mountain. To George Sheldon neither the weather nor the Christmas season made much difference. The ever-current of his life was little disturbed by festive pleasures or dissipations. An extra glass at his tavern, an invitation to dinner from some friend in the bill discounting line, were the most exciting events the season was likely to bring him. He saw the shops brighten suddenly with semi-supernal glories of crystallized fruits in gorgeous bonbon boxes, and he was aware of a kind of movement in the streets that was brisker and gayer than the plodding hurry of everyday life. He stood aside and let the mummeries go by him, and was glad when these Christmas follies were done with, and the law courts in full swing once more. In the happiest and most innocent days of his youth, Christmas had brought him no more than extraordinary indulgences in the way of eating and drinking, swiftly followed by that dread avenger, the demon of the bilious. Upon this particular occasion, Mr. Sheldon had pledged himself to dine with a horsey publican lately retired from business, and big with all the pride and glory of a place at Hornsey. "Come down and see my place, Sheldon," this gentleman had said. "I don't pretend to do the swell thing, but I force my own pines and grow my own grapes, and can put as good a dessert on my table as you could buy in Covent Garden for a 5-pund note. That's my missus' fad, that is, and I can afford it. So why shouldn't I do it? You come and eat your Christmas dinner with us, Sheldon. I've got a friend coming that can sing as good a song as Reeves hisself, and might make a fortune, if he wasn't above coming out at one of them music halls. And I'll give you a bottle of Madeira that you won't match at any nobleman's table. If noblemen's tables was in your line of business, which you and I know they ain't, old fellow." And then the jolly good fellow dug his fat fingers into George Sheldon's ribs, and George accepted the invitation, not with any elation of spirits, but sufficiently pleased to secure a good dinner with a man who promised to be a profitable client, and whose house was within a reasonable cab fare from the West Central district. "The cabmen are trying it on anyhow just now," thought Mr. Sheldon, "but I don't think they'll try it on with me. And if they do, there's the Marylebone stage. I'm not afraid of a 5-mile walk." Having accepted this invitation and thus disposed of his Christmas day, George Sheldon refrained from the delights of social converse at his tavern on Christmas Eve, and occupied himself with business. His clerk left him at the usual hour, but the master sat, long after dark, writing letters and reading law papers, while the snow drifted against his windows and whitened the quiet quadrangle below. He had just laid aside his papers and lighted a cigar, when he was startled by a stealthy knocking at his door. He was not unaccustomed to late visitors, as he was known to live at his chambers, and to work after office hours. But the knocking of to-night was not the loud, rollicking rat-tat-tat of his jolly good fellow friends or clients. If he had been a student of light literature, and imbued with the ghostly associations of the season, he would have gone to his door expecting to behold a weird figure clothed in the vestments of the last century, or an old woman in ruff and martingale, whose figure in the flesh had once haunted those legal precincts, or the ghostly semblance of the Baron of Verulam himself, revisiting the glimpses of the moon and the avenue of elms that were planted by his order. In George Sheldon's nature there was, however, no lurking dread of fiend or phantom. His ideas in connection with ghosts were limited to a white sheet, a broomstick, and a hollow turnip with a lighted candle inside it, and he would have set down the most awful apparition that ever was revealed to German ghost-seer, with a scornful grin, as a member of the sheet and hollow turnip confraternity. "I know how it's done," he would have said, if the spectral form had glowered upon him in midnight churchyard or ruined abbey, "You'd better go and try it on somewhere else, my friend." To a superstitious mind, the thing which crept across the dark lobby and dragged itself into the glare of the gas-lighted office might have seemed, indeed, some creature too loathsome for humanity. A plague-stricken corpse galvanized into a spasmodic life could scarcely have lifted to the light a more awful countenance than that on which George Sheldon looked with mingled anger and disgust. "What do you want here?" he asked. "Do you take this for the workhouse?" "No," the creature answered in a faint hoarse voice, "but I take you for my brother." "What?" cried George Sheldon aghast. He bent down and looked at the awful face. Yes, from the cavernous hollows of those sunken cheeks, beneath the shaggy penthouse of those bony brows, the fierce black eyes of Philip Sheldon looked out at him with a savage glare that he had never seen in them before, even when the savage nature of the man had revealed itself most nakedly, the fierce glare of fever and starvation. This walking horror, this mass of loathsome rags endued with motion, this living disease, was the sometime prosperous stockbroker, the man whom it had been impossible to think of except furnished with linen of spotless whiteness, and the glossy broadcloth, and well-made boots, and keyless chronometer, and silk umbrella of commercial success. "Good God!" exclaimed George, horror-stricken. "Is it you?" "Yes, it's I," answered the creature in his strange husky accents, and the change, nay, indeed, the degradation, of the voice was as complete as the degradation of the man. "Yes, George, it's I. Your brother, Phil. You're surprised to see me fallen so low in the world, I suppose. But you can't be more surprised than I am myself. I've tried hard enough to hold my head above water. There's scarcely any trade that mortal man ever tried to earn his bread by, that I haven't tried, and failed in. It has been the experience of Fitzgeorge Street, over and over again, in every trade and every profession. I started as doctor in Philadelphia, and was doing well, till a patient died, and things went against me. I've been clerk in more offices than you can count on your 10 fingers, but there was always something. My employer levanted, or was bankrupt, or died, or dismissed me. I've been travelling dentist, auctioneer, commission agent, tout, peddler, out yonder, but it all came to the same thing: ruin, starvation, the hospital or the pauper's ward. I have swept crossings in the city, and camped out in the wilderness among the bears and opossums. One day I thought I'd come home. There's George. I said to myself, if I can get money enough to take me across the Atlantic, I shall be all right. George will give me a lift. I don't stand alone in the world. A man's own flesh and blood won't let him starve. Can't let him starve. Blood's thicker than water, you know, George. So I came home. I got the money. Never you mind how. I needn't tell you what it cost me to scrape £6 together. When a man's as low down in the world as I am, there's not a shilling he earns that doesn't cost him a drop of his heart's blood. There's not a pound he gets together that isn't bought by the discount of so much of his life. I found money enough for my passage in an immigrant vessel, and here I am, ready for anything. I'll work like your bought nigger. I'll do the work your clerk does for a quarter of his wages. I'll sweep out your office and run errands for you. You'll give me something to keep body and soul together, won't you, George?" Nothing could be more utterly abject than the tone of this most abject wretch. This man, who in prosperity had been the very personification of hardness and insolence, was transformed into a grovelling, cringing supplicant, ready to lie face downward in the dust beneath the feet of that brother whose patronage or charity he besought. Mr. Sheldon the younger contemplated the supplicant with looks of undisguised gratification. He walked a few paces backward from the spot where his brother had fallen, in a half-sitting, half-crouching attitude, and where he remained, hugging himself in his rags, too abject to be acutely conscious of his degradation. A year ago, and he would have held himself obstinately aloof from all old associations, and would have declared himself ready to face starvation rather than accept, still less supplicate, relief from his younger brother. The events of that 1 year had involved alternations and convulsions that change a year into a cycle. He had faced starvation. He had walked with hunger for his travelling companion. He had lain down night after night in such lairs as a tramp can find for his refuge, with sickness and pain for his bedfellows. The crucible through which he had passed had left him in no more of humanity than its outward semblance. And scarcely that. For when the moral man sinks to the level of the beasts of prey, the physical man undergoes an assimilative process only less marked than that which transforms the mental nature. For 6 months this man had lived by fawning upon or threatening his fellow men, by violence or craft, by the degradation of the vagrant or the audacity of the thief. There is no limit to man's capacity for infamy which he had not touched. Vilest amongst the vile, he had been cast forth from the haunts of beggars and reprobates, as no fitting company for honourable thieves or cadgers of good repute. George Sheldon seated himself astride upon a chair, and, with his folded arms resting on the back of it, contemplated this hideous spectacle. It was a picture that he had never thought to see, and the feeling with which he surveyed it was not unmingled with pleasure. "When you rode me roughshod, my friend, I used to think how I should enjoy taking my change out of you," he said. "But I never thought I should have such an opportunity as this. Never, by Jove! I thought you would ride the high horse to the end of the journey. I didn't think your steed would land you in the gutter. And so you've tried every move, have you? Tumbled upon every platform? And you found all your cleverness no go upon the other side of the 3,000 miles of everlasting wet, as my Yankee friends call the Atlantic. And you've come back whining to me, and I'm to help you, am I? And to give you a fresh start in life, I suppose, and make you my clerk, or my junior partner, eh? That would be better. Messrs. Sheldon and Sheldon wouldn't look bad on my door. That's about what you mean when you talk of blood being thicker than water, isn't it?" The abject wretch who had once been Philip Sheldon felt that his brother was trifling with him, savouring to the last drop that cup of triumph which the chances of fortune had offered to his lips. "Don't play the fool with me, George," he said piteously. "I don't ask you much, a crust of bread, a corner to sleep in, and a cast-off suit of clothes. That's not much for one brother to ask of another." "Perhaps not," replied George Sheldon, "but it's a great deal for you to ask of me. You've had your turn, Phil, and you made the most of it, and contrived to keep me at arm's length. My turn has come at last, and you may depend upon it I shall contrive now to keep you at arm's length." The vagrant stared at him aghast. Here he had felt secure of food and shelter, and he had endured miseries and deprivations that reduce a man to a state in which food and shelter seem to constitute the supreme good that can be obtained in this life. "You won't refuse to do something for me, George?" he whined piteously. "I will do nothing for you. Do you hear that, my man? Nothing. You taught me that blood is not thicker than water 12 years ago, when you married Tom Halliday's widow, and drew your purse strings after flinging me a beggarly 100 as you'd throw a bone to a dog. You made me understand that was all I should ever get out of your brotherly love, or your fear of my telling the world what I knew. You gave me a dinner now and then, because it suited you to keep your eye upon me, and you had generally some piece of dirty work on hand that made the advice of a sharp practitioner like me uncommonly useful to you. I don't believe that you ever gave me so much as a dinner that you didn't take payment for in meal or in malt. Don't come howling here now, trying to persuade me that blood is thicker than water, or that brotherhood means anything more than the accident of birth. And now I've said all I have to say, and the sooner you make yourself scarce, the better for both of us." "George!" cried the miserable suppliant, clasping his bony hands convulsively, and whimpering as he had whimpered when he begged his bread in the streets of New York. "You can't mean to turn me out of doors on such a night. Look at me. It was as much as I could do to crawl to this room. I have walked every step of the way from Liverpool. My wretched limbs have been frostbitten and ulcered and bruised and racked with rheumatism and bent double with cramp. I came over in an immigrant vessel, with a herd of miserable creatures who had tried their luck on the other side of the Atlantic, and had failed like me, and were coming home to their native workhouses. You don't know what some of your immigrant ships are, perhaps. People talk about the Black Hole of Calcutta and the Middle Passage. But let them try the cabin of an immigrant vessel, and they'll have a pretty fair idea of what human beings have to suffer when poverty drives the ship. I landed in Liverpool with $50 in my pocket, and I've had neither decent food nor decent shelter since I landed. Give me some hole to lie in, George, till you can get me an order for the nearest hospital. It's a toss-up whether I ever come out of it." "Do you think I'd sleep under the roof that sheltered you?" cried George. "Why not?" "Why not?" "Because I'm afraid of you. Because I'd as soon have a cobra for my companion or a wolf for my bedfellow. I know you. I've seen what you can do, and how you can do it. And if you could do those things when the only pressure upon you was one that you could have cast off by going through the Gazette, what would you not do now, when you are as desperate as a famished wolf, and governed by no better law than that which governs a wolf, the law of self-preservation? Am I to trust a tiger because he tells me he is hungry? No, Phil Sheldon, neither will I trust you." "You will give me some money, enough to keep me alive for a week or two." "Not 1 6 I'll establish no precedent. I'll acknowledge no tie between us. You'd better march. I don't want to send for a policeman, but if you won't go quietly, you must do the other thing." "You mean that?" "Most emphatically, yes." "I didn't think it was in you to be so hard upon me," faltered the wretch in that faint hoarse voice which had grown fainter and hoarser during his interview. "Do you think that I would trust you?" cried George. "Trust you? You call me hard because I won't give you a corner to lie in, and if I did, you would creep out of your corner to poison me or cut my throat. You would crawl into my room in the dead of the night, and put a pillow over my face, and kneel upon it till you've done the trick for me. And then you'd walk off with as much as you could carry, and begin the same kind of work over again with someone else. I tell you, Mr. Phil Sheldon, I will hold no intercourse with you. You've escaped hanging, but there's something that's worse than hanging to my mind, and that is the state of a man whom nobody will trust. You've come to that, and if you had a spark of gentlemanly feeling, you'd have bought 2 pennyworth of rope and hung yourself rather than come cringing to me." "Suppose I don't cringe," said the outcast, dropping the fawning tone of the mendicant for the threatening ferocity of the social wolf. "You'd better give me a trifle to keep body and soul together for the next few weeks. I'm a desperate man, George. You and I are alone up here. You are pretty sure to have ready money about you. And there's your watch. That's worth something. I didn't come here to go away empty-handed, and I won't." He sprang to his feet, and in the next moment the lawyer heard the sharp clicking noise made by the opening of a clasp knife. "Oh," cried he, "that's what you want, is it?" He bent over his desk, with his eyes fixed on those other evil eyes that still retained some likeness to his own, and with his left arm raised in a boxer's defence attitude to guard his head, while his right hand groped for something in a drawer. It was a moment's work. Philip had seized that uplifted left arm, and was hanging on to it like a cat, with his knife between his teeth, when George clapped the muzzle of a revolver to his brow. "There are plenty of wild beasts in London besides you," he said, "and I am not such a fool as to be without the means of settling a chance visitor of your sort. Drop your knife, and march." The outcast dropped his knife submissively. He was too weak for anything more than a spasmodic violence. "Take your pistol away from my head," he whined. "Certainly, when you are outside my door." "You might give me a handful of silver, George. I haven't a week's life left in me." "All the better for society if you hadn't an hour's life in you. Be off. I'm tired of holding this revolver to your head, and I don't mean to let it go till you're off my premises." Philip saw that there was no hope. Food and shelter were all he had hoped for, but even these blessings were not for him. He backed out of the office, closely followed by George, holding the muzzle of the revolver within an inch or so of the fraternal brains. Upon the threshold only did he pause. "Tell me one thing," he said. "You won't give me a sixpence to buy a loaf of bread or a glass of gin. Give me one scrap of comfort. It need cost you nothing. Tell me something bad of Valentine Hawkehurst, that he's gone to the dogs, or drowned himself, that his wife has run away from him, or his house has been burned to the ground. Tell me that he's had a taste of my luck, and that Ann Woolper has died in a workhouse. It will be as good as meat and drink to me, and it will cost you nothing." "If I told you anything of the kind, I should tell you a lie. Valentine Hawkehurst is doing uncommonly well, and has got one of the prettiest little boxes between Wimbledon and Kingston. Ann Woolper lives with them, and is in better feather than she ever was in your time." With this, Mr. Sheldon of Gray's Inn pushed his brother out onto the staircase, and shut his door. Philip sat upon the stairs, and drew his rags together a little, and rubbed his wretched limbs, while the bolts and chains whereby the lawyer defended his citadel clanked close behind him. "I wonder whether he'll pay Hawkehurst a visit," thought George, as he bolted his door, and he had a kind of grim satisfaction in the idea that Valentine's Christmas peace might be disturbed by the advent of that grisly visitor. End of chapter 9. Read by Celine Major. Book the 10th, Chapter 10 of Charlotte's Inheritance. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Celine Major. Charlotte's Inheritance by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. Chapter 10. According to their deeds. "Between Wimbledon and Kingston," muttered the tramp. "If I can drag myself as far as that, I'll go there this night." He went downstairs and out into the pitiless cold and snow, and made his way down Fetter Lane and across Blackfriars Bridge to the Surrey side of the water, stopping to beg here and there. Upon this snowy Christmas night there were plenty of people abroad, and amongst them Philip Sheldon found pitying matrons, who explored the depths of their capacious pockets to find him a halfpenny, and good-natured young men, who flung the copper he besought with piteous professional whine. When he had collected the price of a glass of gin, he went into the first public house he came to, and spent his money. He was too ill to stay the cravings of his stomach with substantial food. Gin gave him temporary warmth and temporary strength, and enabled him to push on vigorously for a little while, and then came dreary periods of faintness and exhaustion, in which every step was sheer pain and weariness. Something of his old self, some remnant of that hard strength of purpose which had once characterized him, remained with him still, utterly fallen and brutalized as he was. As a savage creature of the jungle might pursue a given course, pushing always onward to that camp or village whence the scent of human flesh and blood was wafted to his quivering nostrils, so Philip Sheldon pushed on towards the dwelling place of that man and that woman whom of all creatures upon this earth he most savagely hated. "There's nothing left for me but to turn housebreaker," he said to himself, "and the first house I'll try my hand upon shall be Valentine Hawkehurst's." The idea of violence in such a creature was the idea of a madman. Weapon he had none, nor the physical strength that would have enabled him to grapple with a boy of 12 years old. Half intoxicated with the spirits he had consumed on his long tramp, half delirious with fever, he had a vague notion that he could make an entrance into some ill-defended house under cover of night, and steal something that should procure him food and shelter. And let the house be Valentine Hawkehurst's, the man who had baffled his plans and crushed him. If blood must be shed, let the blood be his. Never was man better primed for murder than the man who tramped across Wimbledon Common at 11 o'clock this night, with the snow drifting against his face, and his limbs shaken every now and then by an ague fit. Happily for the interests of society, his hand lacked the power to execute that iniquity which his heart willed. He reached a little wayside inn near the Robin Hood gate of Richmond Park, just as the shutters were being closed, and asked a man if any one of the name of Hawkehurst lived in that neighbourhood. "What do you want with Mr. Hawkehurst?" asked the man, contemptuously. "I've got a letter for him." "Have you? A begging letter, I should think, from the look of you." "No, it's a business letter. You'd better show me where he lives, if he's a customer of yours. The business is particular." "Is it? You're a queer kind of messenger to trust with particular business. Mr. Hawkehurst's house is the third you come to on the opposite side of the way. But I don't suppose you'll find anybody up as late as this. Their lights are out by 11, in a general way." The third house on the opposite side of the road was half a mile distant from the little run. Lights shone bright in the lower windows as the tramp dragged his tired limbs to the stout oaken gate. The gate was fastened only by a latch, and offered no resistance to the intruder. He crept with stealthy footsteps along the smooth gravel walk, sheltered by dark laurels, on which the light flashed cheerily from those bright windows. Sounds of laughter and of music pealed out upon the wintry air. Shadows flitted across the blinds of the broad bay windows. Philip Sheldon crept into a sheltered nook beside the rustic porch, and sank down exhausted in the shadow of the laurels. He sat there in a kind of stupor. He had lost the power of thought, somehow, on that dreary journey. It seemed almost as if he had left some portion of his being out yonder in the cold and darkness. He had difficulty in remembering why he had come to this place, and what that deed was which he meant to do. "Hawkehurst," he muttered to himself. "Hawkehurst, the man who leagued against me with Jed. I swore to be even with him if ever I found the opportunity. If ever. And George refused me a few shillings. My brother, my only brother, refused to stand my friend." Hawkehurst and George, his only brother, the images of these two men floated confusedly in his brain. He could scarcely separate them. Sometimes it seemed to him that he was still sitting outside his brother's door, on the staircase in Gray's Inn, hugging himself in his rags, and cursing his unnatural kinsman's cruelty. Then in the next moment he remembered where he was, and breathed bitter curses upon that unconscious enemy whose laugh pealed out every now and then amid a chorus of light-hearted laughter. There was a little Christmas party at Charlottenburgh. 2 flys were waiting in the Laurel Avenue to convey Mr. Hawkehurst's guests to distant abodes. The door was opened presently, and all the bustle of departure made itself heard by that wretched wayfarer who found it so difficult to keep his hold upon the consciousness of these things. "What is it?" he said to himself. "A party? Hawkehurst has been giving a party." He had lived through too much degradation, he had descended in too deep a gulf of wretchedness, to be conscious of the contrast between his present situation and his position in those days when he had played the host, and seen handsome carriages bear prosperous guests away from his door. In that cycle of misery which he had endured, these things and the memory of them had faded from him as completely as if they had been obliterated by the passage of a century. The hapless wretch tried to give sustained attention to all the animated discussion that attended the departure of the merry guests. 6 people seemed to be talking at once. Valentine was giving his friends counsel about the way home. "You will keep to the lower road, you know, Fred. Lossley's cab can follow yours. You came a couple of miles out of your way, and tell that fellow Battersea Bridge is a mistake." And then followed Charlotte's friendly questioning about wraps and hoods and comforters and other feminine gear. "And when are you coming to dine at Fulham?" cried one voice. "I shall certainly get those quadrilles of Offenbach's," said another. "How delightfully Mr. Lossley sang that song of Santley's." And anon a chorus of "Never enjoyed myself more," Most delightful evening. Pray don't come out in the cold. Thanks. Well, yes, yours are always capital. No, I won't light up till I'm on the road. Give my book a lift in the D.H., eh, old fellow? Are you quite sure that shawl is warm enough? Take a rug for your feet. Thanks, no. Good night. See you on Tuesday. Don't forget the box for D.L. All right, old fellow. Lower Road, Roehampton Lane, Putney Bridge. Good night. Among the confusion of voices Philip Sheldon had recognized more than one voice that was familiar to him. There were Charlotte's gentle tones, and Valentine's hearty baritone, and another that he knew. Diana Paget. Yes, it was her voice. Diana Paget, whom he had cause to hate for her interference with his affairs. A beggar, he muttered to himself, and the daughter of a beggar. She was a nice young lady to set herself in opposition to the man who gave her a home. The vehicles drove away, but there was still a little group in the rustic porch. Valentine and Charlotte, with Monsieur and Madame Lenoble, who had come to spend their Christmas with their English friends. "How we have been gay this evening!" cried Gustave. "There is nothing like your English interior for that which you call the comfortable, the jolly, you others. Thy friends are the jollity itself, Hawkehurst. And our acting charades, when that we all talked at once, and with such emphasis on the word we would make to know. Was it not that our spectators were cunning to divine the words? And your friend Losely, it is a mixture of Got and Sanson. It is a true genius. Think then, Diane, while we were amusing ourselves, our girls were at the midnight mass at the Sacré-Cœur. Dear pious children, their innocent prayers ascended toward the heavens, for we who are absent. Come, Madame Hawkehurst, Diane, it makes cold." "But we are sheltered here, and the stars are so bright after the snow," said Charlotte. "Do you remember the Christmas day you spent at the lawn, Valentine, when we walked in Kensington Gardens together, just when we were first engaged?" the young wife added shyly. "Do I not remember? It was the first time the holiness of Christmas came home to my heart. And now let us go back to the drawing-room, and sit round the fire, and tell ghost stories. Lenoble shall give us the legends of Côtenoir." "Valentine," murmured Charlotte, "do you know that it is nearly 1:00? "And we must put in an appearance at church to-morrow morning. And Lenoble has to walk to Kingston to early mass. We will postpone our ghost stories to New Year's Eve, and Lenoble shall read Tennyson's New Year, to demonstrate his improvement in the English language. Lead the way, Mrs. Hawkehurst. Your obedient slave obeys. Mamma is waiting for us in the drawing-room, marvelling at our delay, no doubt. And Nancy Woolper stalks ghost-like through the house, oppressed by the awful responsibility of to-morrow's pudding." Anon came a clanking of bolts and bars, and Philip Sheldon, for the second time that night, heard a door shut against him. As the voices died away, his consciousness of external things died with him. He fancied himself on the Gray's Inn staircase. "Don't be so hard upon me, George," he muttered faintly. "If my own kith and kin turn against me, whom shall I look to?" Mrs. Woolper opened the door early next day, when night was yet at odds with morning. All through the night the silent snowflakes had been falling thick and fast, and they had woven the shroud of Philip Sheldon. The woman who had watched his infant slumbers 40 years before was the first to look upon him in that deeper sleep, of whose waking we know so little. It was not until she had looked long and closely at the dead face that she knew why it was that the aspect of that countenance had affected her with so strange a pang. She did recognise that altered wretch, and kept her counsel. Before the bells rang for morning service the tramp was lying in the dead house of Kingston Union, whither he had been conveyed very quietly in the early morning, unknown to any one but the constable who superintended the removal, and the servants of Mr. Hawkehurst's household. Only the next day did Ann Woolper tell Valentine what had happened. There was to be an inquest. It would be well that some one should identify the dead man, and establish the fact of Philip Sheldon's decease. Valentine was able to do this unaided. He attended the inquest, and made arrangements for the outcast's decent burial, and in due course he gave Mrs. Sheldon notice of her freedom. Beyond that nameless grave, whose fancy shall dare follow Philip Sheldon? He died and made no sign. And in the last dread day, when the dead, small and great, from the sea and from the grave, press together at the foot of the great white throne, and the books of doom are opened, when above shines the city whose light is the glory of God, and below yawns the lake of fire, what voice shall plead for Philip Sheldon? What entreating cry shall pity send forth that sentence against him may be stayed? Surely none, unless it issue from the lips of that one confiding friend, whose last words upon earth thanked and blessed him, and whose long agonies he watched with unshaken purpose, conscious that in every convulsive change in the familiar face, and every pang that shook the stalwart form, he saw the result of his own work. Perhaps, at that dread judgment day, when every other tongue is silent, the voice of Tom Halliday may be heard pleading for the man who murdered him. End of Chapter 10. Recorded by Celine Major. End of Charlotte's Inheritance by Mary Elizabeth Braddon.